Okay, Peter, we're going to talk to parents now about the biblical understanding of sex. How would you go about that?
Right. So the first thing that is really important to understand about the biblical view of our sexuality is that, like every other part of us, because we're made in the image of God, there's so much of us that is correct in the way that we see things, but because of the fall, there's so much of our thinking that's polluted. So, for instance, the first thing that a parent needs to communicate to their child is that because of the fall, because of our nature, our appetites and our desires of expression in our sexuality is going to be distorted in some way, right? Everybody. There's no distinction. There's no person on this planet that was born naturally with a completely consistent sexuality as the biblical worldview. They don't exist. And so when you're communicating with your child, it's important to understand how their sexuality is at odds with the biblical worldview, and even express how yours is as well, right? So we talked about in our last video that there's different types of sexual appetite. Some people's are stronger than others. But just because you have a lower sexual appetite doesn't mean that you see sexuality in the exact way that the Bible does, right? So you may not lust in the sense that you desire to view pornography or you desire to have adultery or sex with many different partners, but you might have more of an emotional type of connection to sexuality that can be unhealthy, right? You might be more of like a codependent person who enables people, who expresses their needs to others through the way that they relate to them. So they're not able to actually love them in a caring way, but they're actually loving people so that they can feel important.
Yeah, or you might be a person who doesn't really like to engage in sex, though you're married,
right?
And though you're with someone.
That's right.
And so the way that your selfishness goes, your fallen nature, that's what we would call it, your fallen nature. And that's important for a parent to communicate, that we have this fallen nature. That what we would do in that situation is, instead of engaging in sexuality like we should, with a good heart and good attitude, instead we pull it away and we use sexuality as like a kind of vice, as like a way to control.
Right.
So that's another way.
That's right. That's right. And there's many others. But the important thing to always communicate to your child, because like I said, when your kid grows up, they're going to develop negatives in their sexuality, meaning pollutions or distortions, as opposed to the biblical worldviews.
Yeah, and what parents too should remember is just go back to the beginning, go back to Genesis,
right?
And share with your kid the understanding of the perfection that God created.
Right. One
man, one woman for life, engaging in sexuality. That was the first command.
Right.
And when you tell your kid that, especially if they're an older student, like a teenager, that the first command was sex, be fruitful and multiply, they're going to go like, whoa, that's a trip. I mean, God's pro-sex.
Right.
And that's an important concept to kind of convey, right?
Right, that's right.
That God is pro-sex, because most teenagers, they kind of look at Christianity and they might say, well, man, God's not pro-sex at all. Well, no way, man, that's the first thing.
Right. That's right. Where we as Christians, the way that we see, when we say the biblical worldview of sex, what we mean by that is we understand that we have a fallen, distorted nature. And so what we're doing is we're inviting our Savior, the author and perfecter of all things, into our lives in every avenue and aspect. Right? So I'm bringing God into my worldview when it comes to money. I'm bringing God into my worldview when it comes to anger. I'm bringing God into my worldview when it comes to family, relationships, everything like that. Your sexuality is no different. One of the reasons why so many young people struggle with the concept of bringing God into their sexuality is because they think that God and sexuality are separate and they're distinct. That God has no part of sexuality, that he might even be disgusted by it or ashamed of it or something to that nature. And if that's the message that's been conveyed to your child, then they're never going to be able to get what we call a biblical worldview.
Hence why if you just keep demonizing the bad stuff, they're going to keep thinking that God is against sex.
That's right. That's right. When nothing could be further from the truth. In the Bible, in the second page, as Bo said, you have Adam and Eve is brought to him, and you have to keep in mind that they're both naked. And Adam looks at her and he's so overjoyed over the pleasure that her form gives him he says, at last, this is now bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So there is a rejoicing in Adam in his sexuality and his desire for his wife. And the Proverbs, in Proverbs 5, verse 18, talks about a man being overjoyed and enraptured in the love of his wife, and that he would be satisfied on her breasts. You know, you have an entire book of the Bible dedicated to sex and sensuality. We call it the Song of Solomon. So the Bible is certainly not shy about this topic. And if you go into Ezekiel, things get really crazy, you know, when it comes to sexuality and how God views right sexuality versus the distortion that the Israelites are engaging in. Really, really interesting stuff. But what you see is that God doesn't have a negative view of sex. What he has a negative view of is our hearts when it comes to sex.
Yeah, and that's the other part of the worldview to communicate to the student, is that to be real simple with them is use the word selfishness. That what's happened is we have a selfish view of money, of whatever, and right. Sex is one of those things. And what happens when we try to take the reins of our own sexuality, then what we're more concerned about is our identity instead of what God says about my sexuality. And so when you get with your kids, like, you know, you can get with your kids and say, hey, I want to do this with my sexuality, but I'm inviting God into my life to change my heart, to transform it into what he intended for my sexuality instead of what I want to do. So the culture might be into, you know, everybody having their own identity. Right. But what God says is, let's get the identity of God.
Right.
You know, of him. And the reason why is because the chief end of everything is to glorify God.
That's right.
And that's how God is glorified, is when we give him our lives.